A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, Book the Second, The Golden Thread, Chapter 6, Hundreds of People. The quiet lodgings of Dr. Manette were in a quiet street corner, not far from Soho Square. On the afternoon of a certain fine Sunday, when the waves of 4 months had rolled over the trial for treason and carried it, as to the public interest and memory, far out to sea, Mr. Jarvis Lorry walked along the sunny streets from Clerkenwell, where he lived, on his way to dine with the doctor. After several relapses into business absorption, Mr. Lorry had become the doctor's friend, and the quiet street corner was the sunny part of his life. On this certain fine Sunday, Mr. Lorry walked towards Soho early in the afternoon for 3 reasons of habit. Firstly, because on fine Sundays he often walked out before dinner with the doctor and Lucy. Secondly, because on unfavorable Sundays he was accustomed to be with them as the family friend, talking, reading, looking out of the window, and generally getting through the day. Thirdly, because he happened to have his own little shrewd doubts to solve, and knew how the ways of the doctor's household pointed to that time as a likely time for solving them. A quainter corner than the corner where the doctor lived was not to be found in London. There was no way through it, and the front windows of the doctor's lodgings commanded a pleasant little vista of street that had a congenial air of retirement on it. There were few buildings then, north of the Oxford Road, and forest trees flourished, and wild flowers grew, and the hawthorn blossomed in the now vanished fields. As a consequence, country airs circulated in Soho with vigorous freedom, instead of languishing into the parish like stray paupers without a settlement. And there was many a good south wall not far off, on which the peaches ripened in their season. The summer light struck into the corner brilliantly in the earlier part of the day, but when the streets grew hot, the corner was in shadow, though not in shadow so remote that you could see beyond it into a glare of brightness. It was a cool spot, staid but cheerful, a wonderful place for echoes, and a very harbor from the raging streets. There ought to have been a tranquil bark in such an anchorage, and there was. The doctor occupied 2 floors of a large still house, where several callings purported to be pursued by day, but whereof little was audible any day, and which was shunned by all of them at night. In a building at the back, attainable by a courtyard, where a plane tree rustled its green leaves, church organs claimed to be made, and silver to be chased, and likewise gold to be beaten by some mysterious giant who had a golden arm staring out of the wall of the front hall, as if he had beaten himself precious, and menaced a similar conversion of all visitors. Very little of these trades, or of the lonely lodger rumored to live upstairs, or of a dim coach trimming maker asserted to have a counting house below, was ever heard or seen. Occasionally a stray workman, putting his coat on, traversed the hall, or a stranger peered about there, or a distant clink was heard across the courtyard, or a thump from the golden giant. These, however, were only the exceptions required to prove the rule that the sparrows in the plane tree behind the house and the echoes in the corner before it had their own way from Sunday morning unto Saturday night. Dr. Manette received such patients here as his old reputation and its revival in the floating whispers of his story brought him. His scientific knowledge and his vigilance and skill in conducting ingenious experiments brought him otherwise into modest request, and he earned as much as he wanted. These things were within Mr. Jarvis Lorry's knowledge, thoughts, and notice, when he rang the doorbell of the tranquil house in the corner on the fine Sunday afternoon. "Dr. Manette at home?" "Expected home." "Miss Lucy at home?" "Expected home." "Miss Pross at home?" "Possibly at home, but of a certain impossible for a handmaid to anticipate intentions of Miss Pross, as to admission or denial of the fact." "As I am at home myself," said Mr. Lorry, "I'll go upstairs." Although the doctor's daughter had known nothing of the country of her birth, she appeared to have innately derived from it that ability to make much of little means, which is one of the most useful and most agreeable which is one of its most useful and most agreeable characteristics. Simple as the furniture was, it was set off by so many little adornments of no value but for their taste and fancy, that its effect was delightful. The disposition of everything in the rooms, from the largest object to the least, the arrangement of colors, the elegant variety and contrast obtained by thrift in trades, by delicate hands, clear eyes, and good sense, were at once so pleasant in themselves and so expressive of their originator, that as Mr. Lorry stood looking about him, the very chairs and tables seemed to ask him, with something of that peculiar expression which he knew so well by this time, whether he approved. There were 3 rooms on a floor, and the doors by which they communicated being put open, that the air might pass freely through them all, Mr. Lorry, smilingly observant of that fanciful resemblance which he detected all around him, walked from one to another. The first was the best room, and in it were Lucy's birds and flowers and books, and desk and work-table, and a box of water-colors. The second was the doctor's consulting room, also used as the dining room. The third, changingly speckled by the rustle of the plane tree in the yard, was the doctor's bedroom, and there, in a corner, stood the disused shoemaker's bench and a tray of tools, much as it had stood on the 5th floor of a dismal house by the wine-shop in the suburb of Saint Antoine in Paris. "I wonder," said Mr. Lorry, pausing and looking about, "that he keeps that reminder of his sufferings by him." "And why wonder at that?" was the abrupt inquiry that made him start. It proceeded from Miss Pross, the wild red woman, strong of hand, whose acquaintance he had first made at the Royal George Hotel in Dover, and had since improved. "I should have thought," Mr. Lorry began. "Pooh! You'd have thought," said Miss Pross, and Mr. Lorry left off. "How do you do?" inquired that lady then, sharply, and yet as if to express that she bore him no malice. "I am pretty well, thank you," answered Mr. Lorry with meekness. "How are you?" "Nothing to boast of," said Miss Pross. "Indeed?" "Ah, indeed," said Miss Pross. I am very much put out about my Lady Bird." "Indeed?" "For gracious sake, say something else besides 'indeed,' or you'll fidget me to death," said Miss Pross, whose character, disassociated from stature, was shortness. "Really, then?" said Mr. Lorry as an amendment. "Really, it is bad enough," returned Miss Pross, "but better, yes. I am very much put out." "May I ask the cause?" "I don't want dozens of people who are not at all worthy of Lady Bird to come here looking after her," said Miss Pross. "Do dozens come for that purpose?" "Hundreds," said Miss Pross. It was characteristic of this lady, as of some other people before her time and sense, that whenever her original proposition was questioned, she exaggerated it. "Dear me," said Mr. Lorry, as the safest remark he could think of, "I have lived with the darling, or the darling has lived with me, and paid me for it, which she certainly should never have done. You may take your affidavit. If I could have afforded to keep either myself or her for nothing since she was 10 years old, and it's really very hard," said Miss Pross, not seeing with precision what was very hard. Mr. Lorry shook his head, using that important part of himself as a sort of fairy clock that would fit anything. "All sorts of people who are not in the least degree worthy of the pet are always turning up," said Miss Pross. "When you began it—" "I began it, Miss Pross?" "Didn't you, who brought her father to life?" "Oh, if that was beginning it," said Mr. Lorry. "It wasn't ending it, I suppose. I say, when you began it, it was hard enough. Not that I have any fault to find with Dr. Manette, except that he is not worthy of such a daughter, which is no imputation of him, for it was not to be expected that anybody should be under any circumstances. But it really is doubly and trebly hard to have crowds and multitudes of people turning up after him." I could have forgiven him to take Lady Bird's affection away from me. Mr. Lorry knew Miss Pross to be very jealous, but he also knew her by this time to be, beneath the surface of her eccentricity, one of those unselfish creatures found only among women who will, for pure love and admiration, bind themselves willing slaves to youth when they have lost it, to beauty that they never had, to accomplishments that they were never fortunate enough to gain, to bright hopes that never shone upon their own sombre lives. He knew enough of the world to know that there is nothing in it better than the faithful service of the heart, so rendered and so free from any mercenary taint. He had such an exalted respect for it, that in the retributive arrangements made by his own mind, we all make such arrangements, more or less, he stationed Miss Pross much nearer to the low angels than many ladies immeasurably better got up, both by nature and art, who had balances at Tellson's. "There never was, nor will be, but one man worthy of Lady Bird," said Miss Pross, "and that was my brother Solomon, if he hadn't made a mistake in life." Here again Mr. Lorry's inquiries into Miss Pross's personal history had established the fact that her brother Solomon was a heartless scoundrel who had stripped her of everything she possessed as a stake to speculate with, and had abandoned her in her poverty for evermore, with no touch of compunction. Miss Pross's fidelity of belief in Solomon, deducting a mere trifle for this slight mistake, was quite a serious matter with Mr. Lorry, and had its weight in his good opinion of her. "As we happen to be alone for the moment, and are both people of business," he said, when they both got back to the drawing-room and had sat down there in friendly relations, "let me ask you, does the doctor, in talking with Lucy, never refer to shoemaking time yet?" "Never." "And yet keeps that bench and those tools beside him?" "Ah," remarked Miss Pross, shaking her head, "but I don't say he don't refer to it within himself." "Do you believe that he thinks of it much?" "I do," said Miss Pross. "Do you imagine—" Mr. Lorry had begun, when Miss Pross took him up short with, "Never imagine anything. Have no imagination at all." "I stand corrected. Do you suppose? You go so far as to suppose sometimes." "Now and then," said Miss Pross. "Do you suppose," Mr. Lorry went on, with a laughing twinkle in his bright eyes that looked kindly at her, "that Dr. Manette has any theory of his own, preserved through all